Well, the United States and Qatar have been discussing ways to support and develop defense and security collaboration in what analysts are calling a significant diplomatic engagement at a critical time for the Middle East region. Qatar's prime minister and foreign minister met with the U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in Washington, D.C. in a meeting that lasted several hours and covered a broad range of topics, from bilateral defense cooperation to the ongoing regional tensions stemming from the U.S.-Iran confrontation. Both sides said they were emphasizing the importance of continuing coordination and joint consultation to contribute to strengthening regional and international security and stability. The meeting also touched on the future of U.S. military presence in Qatar, particularly at Al Udeid Air Base, which remains one of the most strategically important U.S. military installations in the entire Middle East and serves as the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command operations in the region. Well, joining us from Doha is Zedu Nakani. He's the founding director of the Arab Perspectives Institute, a think tank that has been closely monitoring the evolving dynamics of Gulf security and the broader geopolitical landscape of the Middle East. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. Let's go back to the stories we were covering at the top of the show. Donald Trump says Iran is begging for a deal. Is it? Well, it's a war of words. We can't deny that the private talks and private negotiations have always been there, despite the denial from the Iranian side. This has been a consistent pattern throughout modern U.S.-Iran relations, where public rhetoric and private diplomacy operate on entirely separate tracks. Based on the evidence that took place for the past 2 days, where there was a confirmation of the Pakistani mediation, and Pakistan's role here is quite interesting because Islamabad has historically maintained working relationships with both Washington and Tehran of handling such talks, and that is expected given the scale and the level of this war. What's really interesting is noticing that there are different and new pressure cards that have erupted from this war. Now, if we were to look at the list of proposals or the conditions that Trump was trying to impose upon Iran, none of these points are new. They've always existed prior to the war. The Iranian government has always been in negotiations, either with the US or with the West, and discussing them. These include demands related to Iran's nuclear enrichment program, its ballistic missile capabilities, and its regional influence through allied forces and proxy networks. There might be the vague point about the proxy network where Iran has been able to claim and sometimes not to claim affiliation based on their contextual interests, whatever happens in Lebanon or in Iraq or in Yemen. But two new pressure cards that both sides have been able to implement or discover that they were able to get out of this war is the Hormuz Strait from the Iranian side, and a new card that has been established by Trump's administration in parallel, or in a way, to counter the Iranian privilege of using the Strait of Hormuz as a political leverage in the economic situation or in the economic conversation in the world. And that is attacking the power plant. It's a new card that Trump is trying to use strategically, politically, but also militarily in the war. The significance of this cannot be overstated because it represents a fundamental shift in how the United States is choosing to engage in this conflict, moving from purely military targets to what can be described as economic warfare targeting the very foundations of Iran's civilian infrastructure. Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit more about that, because we saw initially that Donald Trump was the one, essentially, that brought the Strait of Hormuz into play. In this, Iran, we always knew, had that as leverage, and in the past has said and threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. But it was Donald Trump bringing ships towards the region that kind of, to some degree, is said to have forced Iran's hand in that, or forced it to use that leverage. The deployment of additional U.S. naval assets to the Persian Gulf region sent an unmistakable message to Tehran that Washington was prepared for a broader confrontation. And that posture itself changed the calculus on both sides. At the same time, we now have Donald Trump saying we're going to hit the power plants, and that is where we're going to be focusing on now. What's your assessment of the way that Donald Trump is, first of all, using the Strait of Hormuz, but then immediately switching to the power plants, but telegraphing to Iran that this is what his intention is? Because this telegraphing is itself a strategy. By publicly announcing intentions, Trump creates a psychological pressure that is sometimes more effective than the action itself. Well, it's a reflection of an ability to have the upper hand and the symbolic power to threaten an enemy that they are able to dismantle, not just the political system, but also the infrastructure. A country mostly relies on its resources, whether that's electricity, water, oil, energy, and it also makes it a very alarming issue for the region beyond and the world. We've seen what has happened to the oil and the fuel prices to the global economy, including the United States itself. So bringing that conversation, shedding light into the U.S. ability and the U.S. preparedness to further dismantle and further destroy whatever energy infrastructure that exists within the Iranian regime, allowing the hope from an Iran-American military perspective and point of view that even if the war were to end today or in a week or two, we have destroyed the Iranian regime and economy enough that it will make it weaker in the longer years and the following years if global economic sanctions were to continue, meaning that the Iranian regime post the 28th of February would be much more weaker and less resilient than it was prior to February 28th. This is a long-term strategic calculation that goes beyond the immediate military engagement. The idea is essentially to degrade Iran's capacity to rebuild its military and political influence even after the guns fall silent. When you strip away electricity generation, water treatment, and fuel refining capabilities from a nation of over 80 million people, you are not just fighting a government, you are creating conditions of suffering for ordinary civilians that will take years or even decades to reverse. That moral dimension of this strategy is something that human rights organizations and international observers have been raising with increasing urgency. The Gulf Cooperation Council now coming out and saying that the impact on Gulf countries is not just to do with oil and gas. Of course, that has been the greatest impact, the most obvious impact of this war that we've seen around the world. But they're also saying it's going to affect food, it's going to affect medicine as well. It's important to remember that when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, we're not just talking about oil and gas and energy. We're talking about so many other things as well. Container ships carrying everything from automobiles to pharmaceuticals to grain to consumer electronics pass through this narrow waterway every single day. The volume of trade that flows through the Strait of Hormuz is simply staggering. And any sustained disruption would send shockwaves through global supply chains that are already fragile following years of pandemic-related disruptions and inflationary pressures. Of course, we're talking about the delivery of goods and essentials for the societies in this region, but also so many other societies and countries that rely on the trading routes around this part of the world. We've already seen the economic implications that this has translated to globally speaking, but it also has two interesting points which, from a GCC point of view, go beyond the energy aspect. It's not just the energy, but it also discusses the militarized aspect, the national security of these countries, and also the humanitarian aspect. The GCC states find themselves in an extraordinarily difficult position. They host U.S. military bases. They have long-standing economic ties with Iran. They depend on stable oil prices for their own budget calculations. And they have populations that are deeply unsettled by the prospect of a wider regional war breaking out on their doorstep. Now, from one point of view, the Iranian attacks and the U.S. dragging the region into this war has allowed the GCC to face a military experience that is very new to it, turning it into being in the middle of a war that they did not choose to be a part of. In fact, they advocated against it happening, pleading with the United States in the weeks and months in the lead up to the conflict to pursue diplomatic solutions and to give sanctions and pressure more time to work. Saudi Arabia in particular reportedly sent multiple diplomatic messages urging restraint. The UAE similarly communicated its concerns through back-channel diplomacy. Qatar, despite hosting the largest U.S. air base in the region, also made clear its preference for a negotiated settlement. And then there's a humanitarian element where a lot of the attacks and the retaliatory attacks towards the so-called U.S. bases in the region included civilian areas and civilian infrastructure, which disrupted the movement, the business, but also the security of ordinary innocent residents and citizens across the region. Hospitals have reported difficulties receiving medical supplies. Schools have been disrupted. Families living near military installations have been forced to relocate. The human cost of geopolitical maneuvering is always borne most heavily by those who have the least power and the least voice in the decisions being made thousands of miles away in capitals like Washington and Tehran. The broader regional picture is one of profound uncertainty. Countries like Jordan, which has its own complex relationships with both the United States and Iran, are watching these developments with deep anxiety. Iraq, which is caught geographically and politically between American and Iranian influence, faces perhaps the most difficult balancing act of any nation in the region. And smaller states like Bahrain and Kuwait, which have tiny populations, but enormous strategic importance due to their location and their hosting of US military infrastructure, find themselves hoping that the decisions made by great powers will not transform their territories into battlegrounds. The coming weeks will be decisive. Whether the Pakistani mediation effort bears fruit, whether Iran's leadership concludes that a negotiated exit is preferable to continued escalation, whether domestic pressures inside Iran from an economically battered population push the government toward compromise, and whether Donald Trump is willing to accept terms that fall short of total capitulation from Tehran, all of these variables remain in play. What we know with certainty is that the Strait of Hormuz card, the power plant threat, the proxy network question, and the nuclear file are all now on the table simultaneously, and managing all of them at once without catastrophic miscalculation will require extraordinary diplomatic skill from all parties involved. Zedu Nakani, we appreciate, as always, you giving us that breakdown and that broader regional context. It is a situation that continues to evolve rapidly, and we will, of course, be returning to it throughout our programming as new developments emerge. Thank you very much indeed for your time and your analysis tonight. Thank you.